Welcome to a journey through time where history isn't just a memory, but a vivid landscape of events and emotions waiting to be explored anew. You're standing no swaying slightly on the high, wind-blown plateaus of Central Asia. The grass rustles around your boots. You can almost hear the thunder of hooves still echoing in the soil, the way a song echoes even after it's been silenced. Mongol banners have stopped flapping overhead, but the air still smells faintly of smoke saddle leather and distant conquest. This is the world after Genghis Khan. The dust has begun to settle, but it doesn't rest for long. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere interesting, maybe a chilly Icelandic village, or a warm bed in Kuala Lumpur, post your location and local time. I always love knowing where my bedtime stories are traveling. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Great Khan was dead. For a moment, the entire steppe seemed to pause, as if the sky itself waited to see what would happen next. Genghis had carved the largest land empire the world had ever seen, but that didn't mean it was designed to last. In fact, one could argue while tucking yourself further under your blanket that no empire built on speed, terror, and charisma was ever meant to last long at all. Still, Genghis had tried. He named his third son, Ogedei, as his successor. That decision alone sparked more than one bitter family dinner among his descendants, even before the dishes had been cleared. You can imagine the tension: four powerful sons, each with armies, land, and ambition, none particularly thrilled to answer to another. But for now, things held. Ogedei, by most accounts, was capable, shrewd, and less scary than his father, more of a let's build an empire with cities and tax systems guy than a burn it all and ride into the sunset type. He finished conquering northern China and pushed further westward, sending Mongol horses galloping through Russia and even into Hungary and Poland. Here's your first quirky tidbit. The Mongols once considered conquering Western Europe, but decided against it partly because of succession drama. When Ogedei died suddenly in 1241, allegedly after drinking a heroic amount of alcohol, his commanders had to race back to Mongolia for the Kurultai, that giant family meeting where new khans were crowned. Historians still argue whether this unexpected withdrawal saved medieval Europe, or if it was already too fortified and disjointed for full Mongol domination. Either way, the death of a Khan had stopped an invasion, and Europe collectively exhaled. The empire continued to stretch. Under Ogedei and then Mongke Khan, it grew more complex. Bureaucrats were hired. Census records were kept and cities sprang up from the steppes. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, protected by Mongol patrols. Yes, the same folks who used to burn cities were now encouraging safe commerce. Go figure. But beneath the wealth and expansion, the cracks began to form. The Khans weren't just leaders, they were symbols of cosmic order. And the moment that order frayed, things got squabbly. Mongol elite families began bickering over titles, tribute, and territory. It's hard to maintain unity when your cousins are constantly eyeing your pasture with a bit too much interest. Second quirky tidbit. The Mongol postal system, the yam, was so efficient that some historians call it the medieval FedEx. Riders could gallop across Eurasia, switching fresh horses at roadside stations every few dozen kilometers. This was one of the key glues holding the empire together until it wasn't. Once politics got in the way and stations stopped being maintained, the whole thing unraveled faster than a poorly tied saddle strap. The vastness of the empire, once its greatest strength, became its most exhausting burden. Governing from Karakoram, a dusty capital with more felt yurts than stone palaces, became unworkable. Different regions began developing their own identities, needs, and rulers who weren't exactly rushing to take calls from the central Khan anymore. And this quietly and slowly marked the beginning of the end. Not in flames or battles just yet, but in the weary sighs of administrators, the sideways glances at sibling armies, and the gradual shift from one empire into many. So now you ride through a Mongol world still magnificent, still imposing, but no longer immortal. You feel it in the silence between hoofbeats, in the way merchants bargain, in a dozen languages, in the way generals glance nervously to the east when they should be watching the west. The storm has passed, but you can't shake the feeling that the real trouble is just beginning. You ride through a sea of grass where the wind rolls over the steppe like a silent drumbeat. Somewhere in the distance, a falcon circles lazily above a mound that might once have been a battlefield or just a forgotten hill. The Mongol Empire is still vast, stunningly vast, but when you peer closer, the threads holding it together are already fraying. It all comes down to four sons. Genghis Khan had four legitimate sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogaday, and Tolui. And while they may have shared their father's blood, they definitely didn't share his unity of purpose. Dividing an empire might sound like a clever way to avoid conflict, but in this case it worked about as well as giving toddlers a single cookie and telling them to just share. Ogaday had already been declared Great Khan, and when he died, leadership briefly passed through his line. But politics in the Mongol Empire was never a straight line, it was a web. And like any good spider web, it trembled violently at the lightest pressure. Tolui's sons, especially Monka and Kublai, were rising fast. Monka managed to be declared Great Khan in 1251 with a little help from Kublai's military successes and a lot of help from purges that removed potential rivals. You meanwhile just try not to make eye contact with any disgruntled cousins as heads quietly roll into the dust. One of the empire's oddest features is how aggressively decentralized it was. Even at its peak, it was more like four independent empires wrapped in a fur coat and calling itself a family. Each son's line governed a portion. The Golden Horde Yassi's descendants ruled the steppes of Russia and the Volga. The Chagatai Khanate covered Central Asia, roughly modern-day Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu Tolui's son, dominated Persia and parts of the Middle East. And then there was the Yuan dynasty in China, where Kublai Khan styled himself more Chinese emperor than nomad warlord. On paper, they all reported to the Great Khan. In reality, they each acted like kings in their own right, some more obedient than others, and most quietly fantasizing about being the one true Khan. Quirky tidbit number 1. The Chagatai Khanate had a weird relationship with both Islam and Mongol tradition. Early on, its rulers tried to stick to shamanistic Mongol customs, even as the surrounding world grew increasingly Islamic. This led to such culture clashes as refusing to allow paper money, which they considered un-Mongol, and banning alcohol during Ramadan, until someone pointed out the Khans were in fact drunk most of the time. Back in China, Kublai was building a dazzling new capital Dadu, later Beijing, while simultaneously drifting away from his nomadic roots. He wore silk instead of leather, hosted tea ceremonies instead of goat feasts, and preferred Confucian scholars to rough-riding generals. You picture his Mongol relatives side-eyeing him over a fermented mare's milk, muttering, "He used to be cool." Historians still argue whether Kublai's transformation into a Chinese-style emperor was a brilliant act of adaptation or a betrayal of Mongol identity. Either way, it alienated many in the Western Khanates who saw Kublai not as a unifier, but as an imperial bureaucrat in an oversized robe. Second quirky tidbit: Hulegu, founder of the Ilkhanate, famously sacked Baghdad in 1258. It was one of the most brutal events of the medieval world, the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate and the razing of one of Islam's greatest cities. But Hulegu also had a fondness for astrology and built an enormous observatory in Moraga with astronomers from across Asia working together. The empire swung between scorched earth destruction and Renaissance-like curiosity like a very confused pendulum. As you drift among these khanates dodging tax collectors in Samarkand and overhearing traders in Tabriz, you begin to notice something important. The khans are growing more isolated from each other. Their advisors whisper of regional pride, their treasuries depend more on local taxes than imperial tribute, and their armies answer to regional generals rather than the distant Great Khan. It's like watching a band where every member has gone solo, but they still occasionally release albums under the group name to keep up appearances. And underneath it all, the people of the empire, Turks, Persians, Chinese, Russians, Arabs are starting to see their rulers not as Mongols from afar, but as local powers. The Mongol name still carries weight, but the unity behind it has begun to crumble. You ride on, through snow-dusted mountains in the Ilkhanate, where a local noble complains that his taxes now go to Tabriz, not Karakorum. Through the wheat fields of the Golden Horde, where new alliances form, not by Khanate decree but from pragmatic deals with Slavic princes. Through the forests of Central Asia, where Chagatai's descendants mutter about proper Mongol values, while wearing imported silks and plotting against each other, the great Mongol Empire as a unified concept is already dissolving into a dream, one that everyone still pretends is real but no longer believes in. You reach a wide bend in the road, where a trade caravan from the Yuan crosses paths with a Persian delegation from the Ilkhanate. They smile, they nod, they share fermented milk and talk of our great Khan. But you see the way their guards watch each other, hands never far from their sword hilts. The empire still lives, but only just. And the worst part, no one seems to notice it's dying. The air in China is heavier, not just from the mist curling through the valleys and over the lakes of Hangzhou, but from the weight of ambition. Kublai Khan is here now, grander, heavier himself, perhaps both in robes and responsibilities. He no longer gallops over the grasslands. He governs from palaces built with glazed tiles and guarded not by warriors on horseback, but by eunuchs and clerks with crisp handwriting. You sit in the shadow of his court tucked between a scholar's ink-stained desk and a general's restless boots. This is no longer the Mongolia of yurts and roaring fires. This is the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, is in many ways more emperor than Khan now. He has proclaimed himself the legitimate son of heaven. He issues edicts in Chinese, recites poetry with Confucian scholars, and installs a massive civil service based on merit exams. Except, of course, for the top jobs, which somehow always go to Mongols. Meritocracy has its limits. The capital Dadu is a marvel. Imagine it wide avenues laid out on a precise grid, canals filled with barges of rice and silk towers that glint under moonlight. There's even a department of sacrifices and a court of imperial entertainments, because nothing says stable governance like sacrificing goats and throwing really good parties. But there's a cost. To many Mongols, Kublai is no longer one of them. He rarely visits the steppe. He prefers Chinese customs over shamanistic traditions. He has even started enjoying tofu. Historians still argue whether Kublai's sinification was a necessary evolution for ruling China, or a slow betrayal of his grandfather's vision. But what's undeniable is that it changed the very nature of Mongol power. What once rode on horseback now sits behind a jade-inlaid desk. Quirky tidbit time. Kublai Khan's court had a whole department just to handle astronomy and calendrical matters. They even dabbled in mechanical clocks and cosmological maps. You wonder if any of the Khans before him had ever cared what phase the moon was in unless it was just bright enough to launch a night raid. And yet, for all his success in empire building, Kublai struggled to hold everything together. His expansionist dreams never fully materialized. His naval attempts to conquer Japan failed twice, with the first campaign in 1274 and the second in 1281 ending in storms, disarray, and poetic Japanese legends of divine winds or kamikaze. The court grew bloated. The bureaucracy ballooned. Entire ministries sprang up like mushrooms after a storm, each one with secretaries, deputy secretaries, assistants to deputy secretaries, and assistants to those assistants, all wearing the appropriate robes in the appropriate seasonal color palette. Second quirky tidbit, Kublai hired thousands of foreign administrators, including Persians, Uyghurs, and even the Venetian traveler Marco Polo. Yes, that Marco Polo. And no, you can't tell if his tales are 100% true, but you can picture him dazzled by the fireworks, elephant parades, and ice cream-like frozen milk desserts served at banquets. But even as he fostered trade and built cities, rebellions simmered. Chinese nobles, Buddhist monks, Taoist sects, and even rogue Mongol generals began to mutter. The empire felt artificial, held together not by loyalty but by paychecks and fear. And then there's the money. Kublai implemented a sweeping paper currency system, the first of its scale in the world. At first it worked beautifully. Light to carry, easy to exchange, standardized. But over time, as wars dragged on and deficits mounted, the court printed more and more without backing it in precious metals. Inflation crept in. Trust eroded. By the end of his reign, the market treated yuan paper bills the way you'd treat soggy playing cards, pretty to look at, but you wouldn't use them to buy a goat. Still, Kublai ruled longer than most of his kin. He died in 1294 after decades on the throne. You picture him in those final moments, bloated, grieving, lost family, facing rebellions in the south, and probably still thinking about Japan's storms. With Kublai's death, the Yuan dynasty lost its anchor. His successors, starting with Timur Khan, lacked the charisma, vision, and stomach for politics. You know the type. Good at ceremonies, terrible at crisis management. The court became increasingly ceremonial, more focused on protocol than governance. Ministers debated the correct order of incense placement, while bandits roamed the countryside. And out in the provinces, the tax collectors grew harsher, the peasants grew hungrier. Local rebellions flickered to life like candle flames, easy to snuff out at first, but soon multiplying faster than any official could track. The cracks in the Yuan dynasty had become fault lines. All across the empire, you feel the ground begin to shift. Meanwhile, in the other khanates, this Chinese experiment is viewed with suspicion. They whisper that the great Khan has gone soft, traded the bow for a brush and the saddle for silks. They no longer trust Dadu or the man who built it. The empire still glitters, but up close you see the rust. You pass a market outside the capital walls. Traders from Persia and Korea haggle under red lanterns. A Mongol officer in a tattered robe slouches against a pillar board. A child chases a paper kite shaped like a tiger. Somewhere, a tacksman yells at a rice merchant. It's all very imperial. But the old Mongol spirit, that wild spark of thunder and conquest, it's fading. And you begin to wonder, can something this grand survive once it forgets what made it dangerous? You ride west now, away from the paper palaces and porcelain teacups of the UN court, and into a grittier realm where the wind still bites like it remembers conquest. This is the domain of the Golden Horde, and the Ilkhanate two of the four great Khanates, once brothers in arms, now barely cousins at best. The Golden Horde, descended from Genghis Khan's eldest son, Yoki, sprawls across the steppes of Russia. Its capital Sarai hugs the lower Volga River like a trading post that got out of hand. Camels snort in the market where Baltic amber sits beside Persian glass and Chinese silk. There's even a section where Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice bargain loudly and badly in half-broken Turkic. Multilingual insults fly. You stay on your horse. Over in Persia, the Ilkhanate's lands shimmer under the sun, from the snowy peaks of the Caucasus to the arid heart of Iran. Founded by Hulagu, remember him from Baghdad burning fame. It's a land of contradictions. Libraries and bloodstains, mad astronomers and even madder tax collectors. A kingdom that wants to be civilized but never quite kicks the habit of invading its neighbors. For a while things were working, sort of. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde should have been allies, both carved from Genghis's world, both speaking similar languages, both still occasionally pretending to respect the Great Khan and Dadu. But instead, they develop a growing fondness for stabbing each other, literally and politically. Quirky tidbit number 1. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde went to war so many times that scholars stopped giving them distinct names and just lumped them together as those pointless border wars. Some of these conflicts weren't even about land or taxes, they were about insults, horse theft, and one memorable argument over a diplomatic gift that involved a dead dog. Yes, really. The roots of the feud were personal. Yoki's legitimacy had always been questioned. Genghis may have fathered him, but rumors swirled that he wasn't the biological son. Hulagu and his descendants never quite forgot that, and the Golden Horde never quite forgave the insult. So while Kublai was sipping jasmine tea, the Western Khanats were busy butchering each other's trade routes and burning each other's border towns. The Mongol Peace Pax Mongolica became more of a theory than a fact. And then there's religion. The Ilkhans were slow to adopt Islam, but eventually did, and fairly enthusiastically. The Golden Horde got there earlier, embracing Islam with a zeal that surprised even the locals. Suddenly, both Khanats began claiming not just political power, but religious legitimacy too. Historians still argue whether the conversion to Islam helped stabilize Mongol rule, or just gave new fuel to old rivalries. On the one hand, it built bridges to the local populations. On the other, it added yet another layer of us versus them between the Khans. Second quirky tidbit. There's a report, possibly exaggerated, that Golden Horde troops once refused to march until a proper crescent moon had risen, convinced that Allah would frown on battle under the wrong sky. Meanwhile, the Ilkhans were hiring Christian advisors and flirting with papal alliances to fight their Muslim cousins. Religious identity was becoming political identity, and the empire's shared past was turning into divergent futures. You picture the steppe from above now like a wrinkled tapestry. On one corner, Mongol cavalry kneels for Friday prayers. On another, envoys in crusader armor sip fermented mare's milk with Ilkhanate diplomats. The banner of Genghis still flaps in the wind somewhere, but no one's really saluting anymore. Meanwhile, smaller players start to rise. In the north, the Muscovites learn quickly from their Mongol overlords how to tax, how to organize, how to play one Khan off another. The princes of Moscow are paying tribute now. Sure, but with every sack of silver they send to Sarai, they gain another lesson in empire. In the south, Mamluk Egypt holds off Hulagu's expansion. In the east, Buddhist rebels in Tibet quietly resist Yuan envoys. The Mongol system, so astonishingly effective at moving armies, is now struggling to move ideas, laws, or trust. Trade still flows, silk, spices, salt, and slaves, but every merchant now travels with more bodyguards. The Yam postal stations are decaying one by one. A letter once took 10 days to cross a continent. Now it takes 30, and there's a 40% chance it gets stolen somewhere near Samarkand by a former Mongol soldier with a grudge. And the empire pretends not to notice. You stand at a dusty intersection of world's Persian scholars in turbans, argue over astronomy while Slavic peasants load salt into battered wagons. The Khan still mint coins with grand titles, but those coins no longer carry across borders. The Khan of Sarai couldn't tell you what the Khan in Tabriz wants, and frankly, he doesn't care. It's not just the empire breaking, it's the idea of it. Even now, under the vast blue bowl of sky with eagles soaring and yurts glowing in the twilight, you can feel the tension. The bonds that once held Mongol brothers together are now snapped cords tangled and sharp. And yet, the stories still linger. At night around campfires, elders tell tales of Genghis Khan's lightning wars and the time when all the world bowed to one ruler. You close your eyes listening to a wrinkled herder sing of past glory and wonder if even he believes it anymore. The great Mongol Empire's not gone. Not yet. But its parts have stopped listening to its heart. The fire crackles softly beside you, but it doesn't warm the air much. This isn't the cozy kind of cold, it's the kind that cuts through fur and memory. You're in the Chagatai Khanate now, the least tidy and most temperamental of the Mongol realms. If the yuan is silk and ceremony and the golden horde is trade and tribute, the Chagatai realm is rough leather grudges and bad decisions. Out here in Central Asia, the empire is practically a family feud with banners. You wander through cities like Al-Malik and Kashgar, where local rulers clutch onto power like misers gripping coins. The territory should be a strategic jewel. It's the beating heart of the Silk Road, after all. But the Chagatai Khanate is less a kingdom and more a cautionary tale. After Chagatai Khan's death, his descendants spend more time plotting against each other than ruling effectively. The Khanate swings wildly between periods of brutal despotism and eerie anarchy. Sometimes there's a Khan, sometimes there are two, occasionally there are none. And the most stable periods, those are when the army is too exhausted to stage a coup. Quirky tidbit number 1. At one point, the Chagatai Khanate split into eastern and western halves, 2 khans, 2 courts, and twice the confusion. Local governors would sometimes receive contradictory orders from both capitals and just flip a coin. Once a city sent tax payments to both khans hoping to avoid a raid from either. Didn't work. And yet somehow the Khanate survives not out of strength, but out of sheer stubborn geography. Nomads still roam the steppe caravans, still pass through oasis towns, and every spring, the yurts reappear on the plains like mushrooms after rain. You pass a city where the bazaar still thrives, ginger from India, jade from Khotan, Chinese lacquerware, even Venetian glass traded hand to hand across thousands of miles. It's beautiful, chaotic, and quietly decaying at the edges. Meanwhile, back in the Yuan court, someone is probably arguing over calligraphy brush weights. And in the Ilkhanate, there's an astrologer debating planetary alignments and whether that means he gets a tax exemption. Here in Chagatai land, it's simpler. Power is taken, held, and lost on horseback, and the horses are getting tired. Civil war in this Khanate becomes something of a seasonal tradition. Every few years, a new Khan rises, usually someone's cousin, brother, or uncle with a name like Tughluq or Quebec, declares sweeping reforms, imposes crushing taxes, and then promptly gets assassinated at a banquet involving far too much fermented milk. Historians still argue whether this was due to deep-rooted tribal instability or just a lack of centralized administrative talent. Some say the region was too diverse to govern effectively. Others point out that stabbing your finance minister during a feast is generally bad for economic continuity. Quirky tidbit number 2. The Chagatai Khanate once banned alcohol outright under a particularly devout Muslim ruler, only for the very next Khan to declare wine drinking mandatory at court functions. The royal banquet menu must have looked like a tug-of-war between haram and hedonism, And religion is indeed shifting the tides. Islam is rising in influence. Early Mongol rulers resisted conversion, clinging to traditional steppe shamanism. But slowly, Islam spreads not just among the ruled, but among the rulers themselves. By the mid-1300s, many Mongol nobles pray facing Mecca instead of whispering to the wind. And with that shift comes new legitimacy, but also new divisions. You watch as Khans begin using religion as a political tool. Some ally with Muslim scholars building madrasas and mosques. Others double down on anti-Islamic decrees trying to hold on to the old ways. It's less a clash of faiths and more a confused identity crisis with swords. You sit beside a cracked mosaic wall in Samarkand, watching the tiles shimmer in the dying light. This city has seen Seljuks, Mongols, and more. Now it waits patiently, wearily for the next conqueror. Because everyone knows this can't last. The Chagatai realm is splintering even as no one quite admits it. The eastern portion, Mogolistan, they'll call it later, starts charting its own path with Turkic-speaking rulers who barely remember what Karakorum ever meant. The western half grumbles, bleeds, and decays. Trade still flows, but caravans are increasingly robbed. Cities still shine, but the roads between them are less safe. And the cons? They keep throwing banquets, issuing grand proclamations, and dying unexpectedly. You pass a caravan resting under a grove of apricot trees. The merchants whisper of trouble in every direction. The horde is weakening, one says. The Ilkhans are killing each other, says another. A third just shrugs and mutters, "Pray for rain." It's not apocalyptic. Not yet. But it is undeniably tired. Like the wheels of an empire grinding down slowly under the weight of its own contradictions. And all the while from the west comes a rumor soft at first, like a storm too distant to hear clearly. A man is rising. Not a Khan, but something worse. Or better, depending on whom you ask. His name is Timur. But for now, you ride on through a realm that still wears the Mongol name, but no longer remembers what it meant. It starts with a cough. Somewhere on the fringes of the empire, maybe a Chinese trading post, maybe a Persian dock, a man coughs, stumbles, and dies. Within weeks, it's not just a cough. It's a plague. And the Mongol Empire, stitched together by its dazzling networks of trade and communication, suddenly finds itself carrying not just silk and spices, but death. You're in the middle of the 14th century now, and the Black Death is galloping across Eurasia faster than even a Mongol courier. The irony is almost poetic. The empire that once prided itself on connecting the world from Beijing to Baghdad, Kiev to Kashgar is now connected in all the wrong ways. You ride past deserted outposts of the Yam postal system. Once you'd have been able to switch horses every 30 kilometers, receive fresh supplies, maybe a hot meal if you were lucky. Now the stations are shuttered. Or worse, still open but quiet. Too quiet. You nudge your horse faster. The plague hits China first, ravaging towns and cities already weakened by war, famine, and bad governance. In the Yuan dynasty, millions die. Some historians say up to 50% of the population in certain provinces. Kublai's successors, already flailing, now face something they can't tax, stab, or bribe. Quirky tidbit number 1. At the height of the plague in China, local officials tried using firecrackers and loud gongs to drive the disease away. One particularly hopeful city even organized a parade of monks chanting, "Go away, demon wind." It did not work. And the disease doesn't stop in China. It rolls through Central Asia like a dark tide, then westward into Persia and the Middle East, into Crimea, and eventually into Europe, thanks in part to Mongol trade networks and Mongol warfare. Here's where it gets extra grim in 1346. Mongol forces besieging the Genoese trading city of Kaffa on the Crimean coast reportedly catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the walls. Historians still argue whether this was intentional biological warfare or just battlefield cleanup gone horribly wrong. Either way, Genoese ships fled the city carrying the disease to Constantinople, then Italy, then all of Europe. The Mongol Empire, once the guarantor of the Silk Road's golden age, now becomes a highway of horror. You ride through Samarkand again. This time it's quieter. The once bustling markets have thinned. The air smells less like spice and more like burning herbs and desperation. A man stands at the city gates ringing a bell, warning travelers to stay away. You keep moving. The Ilkhanate is collapsing. The plague accelerates what was already a steep decline. The last of Hulagu's line dies without a clear heir. Multiple factions rise, claiming legitimacy, loyalty, and in one case divine inspiration from a dream involving a talking goat. You're not sure if he was serious. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some Ilkhanate cities hired astrologers to determine whether the stars had cursed the empire. One astrologer insisted the moon was jealous of Mongol success and needed to be appeased with silver offerings. This led to an economic policy where taxes were paid partly in moon-shaped coins. The treasury was not impressed. Meanwhile, in the Golden Horde, the plague doesn't just kill, it destabilizes. The balance between Mongols and their Slavic vassals starts to shift. Moscow grows bolder, richer. Tribute still flows, but now with muttered complaints and sharper negotiations. And the Chagatai Khanate. If anything, the plague is just another calamity on the pile. Fewer peasants, fewer taxes, fewer soldiers, and more excuses for generals to ignore the Khan altogether. Historians still argue whether the Black Death caused the Mongol Empire's fall, or merely hastened what was already inevitable. After all, the empire was already splintering, already feuding, already forgetting its roots. But the plague made sure that even if you remembered your past, there might not be enough people left to carry it forward. You pause beside a shallow grave, one of hundreds dotting the steppe. There's no marker, just a pile of rocks. A tattered strip of silk flutters nearby, maybe once part of a merchant's sash, maybe a Khan's banner. Now just fabric in the wind. But the wheels of empire don't stop entirely. In Yuan, China, the government tries issuing relief granaries. It works for a time. In the Golden Horde, new Khans emerge briefly, uniting tribes before promptly being poisoned or deposed. The Ilkhanate fragments into a confusing mosaic of warlords, each claiming to be the true successor. Even the Yam system tries to recover. A few brave couriers still ride masked with strips of cloth soaked in vinegar, hoping the spirits of their ancestors outrun the sickness. You find yourself in a roadside inn, empty except for a sleepy dog and a merchant too stubborn to stop traveling. He tells you stories of how the empire once felt endless. You could ride from Korea to Krakow, he says, sipping lukewarm tea. Now I can't even get to Herat without paying 4 bribes and dodging 5 bandits. There's a silence. He shrugs. Still, he adds, the roads are there. Maybe that means something. And you wonder, maybe it does. The Mongol Empire, even in its disintegration, left trails, towns, and technologies that couldn't be erased by plague or politics. But for now, the world grows darker. Not just from death, but from doubt. You leave the inn before sunrise. The air is heavy. The road ahead is cracked. And behind you, the Mongol Empire coughs once more. The road to Dadu winds like an old scar, once firm and straight, now softened by weeds and weather. You tread carefully, boots dusted with pale mud as you approach the Empire's heart once more. Or what's left of it. The Yan dynasty, the Mongol rule over China, is beginning to wobble like a porcelain vase spun just a little too thin. The illusion of control lingers, but the substance has worn away. Kublai Khan, long dead, still casts a shadow, but it's no longer protection, it's a weight. His successors stumble beneath it. You enter the capital under gray skies. The canals are still full. The towers still stand, but the energy has changed. The officials wear finer silks, but their expressions are duller like paintings left out in the rain. Something's rotting beneath the surface. Bureaucracy has multiplied like rabbits, while effectiveness has withered like last year's rice harvest. One Yuan emperor takes the throne as a teenager. Another abdicates and becomes a Buddhist monk. A third is reportedly poisoned by his own courtiers, though no one can quite agree which one. The throne turns into a revolving door of regents, empress dowagers, and scheming eunuchs. You'd keep track, but even the palace scribes seem to have given up halfway through their scrolls. Quirky tidbit number 1. The imperial court once held an emergency session to decide what color shoes ministers should wear during public ceremonies. The debate lasted 3 days. Meanwhile, a flood wiped out 5 villages. The cracks widen. Natural disasters batter the land floods, droughts, locusts. The mandate of heaven, that ancient Chinese concept granting legitimacy to rulers, starts to feel more like a sarcastic meme than a sacred rite. The people begin to murmur, then grumble, then rebel, and so rises one of history's more fashion-forward uprisings, the Red Turban Rebellion. A blend of disgruntled peasants, failed scholars, Buddhist millenarians, and martial artists, because why not the Red Turbans rally around charismatic leaders who promise to cleanse the world of corruption? Their outfits striking, their ideology surprisingly organized, their odds of success increasing by the day. You see them creeping across the countryside at first, just raiding granaries and shouting slogans, but soon storming county seats and toppling local governors. The Yuan government scrambles to respond, but its armies are stretched thin and its generals are busy accusing each other of treason. Historians still argue whether the Yuan lost because of rebellion, economic failure, or ethnic division. After all, the ruling Mongols were still a small minority governing a massive Han Chinese population. Over the decades, resentment festered, especially as Mongols were given privileges in court and law, while Han officials were often blocked from promotion. Quirky tidbit number 2. One Red Turban leader, Han Shantong, claimed to be guided by the King of Light and carried a prophetic wooden fish to court legitimacy. His movement merged Buddhist mysticism with revolutionary zeal. If that sounds strange, consider that another rebel leader insisted his followers abstain from onions. Rebellion apparently requires odd grocery rules. In the midst of this chaos emerges a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant, orphan-turned-monk-turned-warlord who eventually unites the Red Turban factions under his rule. He's disciplined, cunning, and utterly determined. He builds a base of power, reforms his army, and begins to press toward the capital. Inside, Dadu panic brews. Ministers flee. The emperor issues proclamations no one reads. The royal treasury is moved south, or possibly stolen, or both. And in 1368, the hammer falls. Zhu Yuanzhang's forces breach the capital. The last Yuan emperor, Togun Timur, flees north, weeping, reportedly unable to locate his favorite horse in time. His court follows him into the steppe into exile, where they'll continue to claim legitimacy from a distance, like kids insisting they still own the treehouse they moved out of 10 years ago. Zhu declares the founding of the Ming dynasty, and with it the Mongol era in China slams shut. You walk through the palace grounds after the fall. The marble still gleams, but the air feels strange, emptied. A place of ghosts. Paper banners still flap on balconies, and court musicians have left their zithers behind strings broken. And yet the story's not quite over. The Yuan remnants now called the Northern Yuan retreat into Mongolia. They regroup, declare new khans, and continue to launch raids into Ming territory. For a century or more, they fight on, but the momentum is gone. The glory days of Kublai are distant, the empire fragmented. The Great Wall begins to rise again, not to stop all Mongols, but to slow the few who remain. From a windswept hill north of the wall, you look south. The cities are Chinese once more. The Yuan dynasty is a memory recorded in bamboo slips and bitter poetry. Still, those Mongol ruins don't fade quickly. Yuan architecture, legal codes, and even administrative divisions continue under the Ming. Some towns built under Mongol rule remain important trading centers. The post roads might have weeds, but they're still there. And in some quiet corners of the north, old men still mutter prayers to Genghis under the stars and tell tales of the khans who ruled everything. You tie your cloak tighter, the wind is rising. The empire may have fallen, but its echo still rides the steppe. The wind picks up dust as you leave the abandoned courtyards of Dadu behind, riding west again, through fields where battle once roared and now only the grass sighs. In China, the Yuan dynasty is finished. The red turbans dance in celebration, the Ming banners flap in victory. But out in Persia, the Ilkhanate is collapsing too, just with less ceremony and more shouting. The Ilkhanate, descended from Hulegu Khan, had once ruled Persia with iron discipline and surprisingly advanced astronomy. But by the mid-1300s, it's a political clown car Khan. After Khan, each one less competent or shorter-lived than the last. When the last real Ilkhan Abu Sa'id dies in 1335, without an heir, no fewer than 5 factions immediately rise to claim his throne. If you're thinking, surely 5 khans can't rule the same region at once, congratulations. You're right. You wander into Tabriz, one of the former capitals, and it feels more like a stage set than a city. Lavish mosques, half-finished palaces, cracked aqueducts. Once scholars mapped the stars here. Now everyone is mapping alliances and preparing for betrayal. Quirky tidbit number 1. One of the successor khans, Arpakun, was so obsessed with reviving pure Mongol rule that he tried to ban Persian music and reinstate horse sacrifices. This lasted about 3 months before he was assassinated by a rival who played the flute. The real power shifts not to a new Khan, but to regional warlords. The Jalayirids take over parts of Iraq and western Iran. The Chobanids, a rival Mongol family, control Azerbaijan and bits of the Caucasus. Others follow. Each claims legitimacy from the old Ilkhanate. Each prints their own coins and declares loyalty to the House of Genghis, but none can agree on what that means. And then there's the Black Sheep and White Sheep Turkmen tribes, both of whom sound like livestock-themed folk bands, but are in fact brutal military confederations, carving out their own domains in the chaos. Historians still argue whether the Ilkhanate's fall was due more to weak succession or the toll of disease and war. In truth, it's all tangled together. When plague kills your governors, your farmers, and half your scribes, and the Khan can't name an heir, you don't really need an invasion. The system collapses under its own weight. Quirky tidbit number 2. After the Ilkhanate fell, some cities issued coins that simply read in the name of the former Ilkhans. That's like trying to pay rent with the check signed the guy who used to own this place. Meanwhile, local rulers begin behaving like khans themselves. They keep the titles. They build yurts alongside their Persian palaces. Some even trace their bloodline back to Genghis even when their grandfathers were weavers or farmers. Mongol identity, once fierce and distinct, has started to blur into local custom. In one corner of Iran, a minor noble begins to rise. His name? Timur. You've heard whispers already, a man of ambition, cruelty, and vision. He claims descent from Genghis's generals, if not from the Khan himself. But more importantly, he knows how to seize a fractured empire and squeeze it into something that looks like order. But that's a storm still gathering on the horizon. For now, you walk through the remains of Ilkhanid cities. The mosques are still magnificent. The astronomy towers still stand, just barely. A lone scholar sits in an open-air courtyard, copying texts onto camel parchment. He tells you the stars haven't changed even if the rulers have. You nod, not quite convinced. Trade continues in fragments. Caravans still move, but now with double guards and fewer stops. The Silk Road isn't broken, but it limps. The death of the Ilkhanate sends ripple effects across the region. Mamluk Egypt, once threatened by Mongol power, now looks eastward with smug relief. In Anatolia, the Seljuk remnants and rising Ottoman beyliks carve up what's left of Mongol influence. And in India, the Delhi Sultanate adjusts its alliances, less fearful of a Mongol hammer that no longer swings. You pass through Herat and see its famous poet still writing, still dreaming, even as taxes go unpaid and bandits raid the outer towns. Civilization, it seems, has a way of enduring even if empires don't. The Ilkhanate is gone, but no one throws a funeral. Too many factions, too many claimants, too little left to bury. You sit on a crumbling wall outside Sultania and look up at the stars, the same stars Hulagu consulted when he built observatories and dreamed of empire. Now all that remains are outlines in the dark and half-finished domes. Somewhere to the east, Timur is preparing his march, but tonight the land is still. A wind rustles the grass, you listen for hoofbeats, and for the first time in a long while, you hear none. It begins with murmurs, always murmurs. In China, the UN has fallen. In Persia, the Ilkhanate has crumbled. And now, across what's left of the Mongol world, local rulers glance over their shoulders and realize something startling. There's no one really in charge anymore. You're standing in a dusty courtyard in Bukhara, and the feeling is unmistakable. Once proclamations came stamped with the Great Khan's seal enforced by men on horseback who traveled faster than rumor. Now they come from regional warlords with very creative interpretations of legitimacy. And every caravan guard you talk to has a different answer when asked who rules this territory. The age of the centralized Mongol Empire is truly dead. What remains is a mosaic of Khanate's tribal alliances and ambitious upstarts, all of them trying to act imperial, but none of them willing to bow to anyone else. This is the rise of the local dynasties. And they're not Mongol in the old sense, not nomads on endless horseback, but something else. Hybrid rulers, half steppe, half palace. Mongol names with Persian habits. Silk robes over leather hearts. Take the Jalayirids in Baghdad. Once vassals of the Ilkhans, now they rule like proper kings, minting coins with their own faces and building towers in their own honor. Their enemies, the Chobanids, claim the same legacy and attack on alternating Tuesdays. Neither side controls more than a few provinces at a time, but both insist they are the rightful heirs of Genghis. Quirky tidbit. Number 1. In one absurd incident, two rival Mongol-descended rulers in western Iran declared war on each other, then sent messengers to a third Khan asking for mediation, who responded by declaring himself Great Khan and demanded tribute from both. It was ignored, but he kept sending invoices anyway. Sending. In the Chagatai lands, it's the same story. The realm has splintered into Mogolistan in the east and a chaotic cluster of Turkic-Mongol city-states in the west. These rulers still call themselves Khans. Their banners still depict wolves and steppe spirits. But their power is regional, their legitimacy self-declared. Historians still argue whether this fragmentation represented decline or evolution. One camp sees it as a tragic end, the empire collapsing into petty kingdoms. Another camp sees cultural fusion, the Mongol legacy, adapting, mingling with local traditions, becoming something new. You decide it's both. beautiful and sad, efficient and unstable, Mongol and not Mongol. Quirky tidbit number 2. In Mogulistan, some rulers began adopting local Turkic titles like Khan of the East Wind or Protector of the Winter Rivers. No one knew what those meant, but they looked fantastic on coinage. The Golden Horde is fragmenting too. The White Horde, Blue Horde, and other generically color-coded factions peel off from the center. Rival Khans spring up like daisies after rain. One rules for 7 days, another lasts nearly a year. Moscow, meanwhile, is watching quietly and growing bold. You reach the Volga River and find a merchant town once packed with tribute-laden caravans. Now the docks are quieter. A local noble rules here, technically under the Horde, but practically independent. He hosts tea with Italian envoys and threatens neighboring princes with nostalgic references to past Mongol wrath. It's theater, but sometimes theater is enough. The old Mongol imperial institutions are now mostly stage props. The Yam system has collapsed. The central census books are lost or ignored. The language of command, once the clipped, sharp barks of the steppe, has softened into courtly Persian, courtly Chinese, and courtly silence. You pass through Khorasan and see an ancient caravanserai, half filled with traveling mystics debating poetry and tax law. One old man leans over and whispers, "The Khans are gone, child. Only their shadows remain, and yet life goes on. Cities still function. Markets still open. Local rulers still proclaim law and order. What's gone is the unity, the terrifying efficiency, the shared mission of conquest and control. The Mongol Empire was never built to last this way. It was designed for mobility fear and loyalty to a single sacred bloodline. Once that bloodline fragmented, and once the steppe began to settle, what was left was a set of very clever warlords dressed as emperors. And if you listen closely through the wind across the plains, through the muttering of scribes, and the creak of old wooden gates, you'll hear a new name whispered. Not a Khan, not a descendant of Genghis. A man named Timur is gathering power, not claiming to be Khan, but claiming to restore the Khanate. Not a Mongol, not exactly. A Muslim Turkic warrior with Mongol ancestry, military genius, and an ego visible from orbit. He sees the local dynasties not as permanent fixtures, but as stepping stones, or speed bumps. But for now, they rule. And for a time the world accepts this new normal. You camp near a ruined watchtower built during the Ilkhanate. It once signaled the passage of imperial caravans. Now it's just a stone perch for birds. You lie back and stare at the stars. They haven't moved, but the earth below them has reshaped completely. In the morning you'll ride again, through kingdoms that still call themselves Khanates, through cities that wear Mongol names like borrowed coats, through a world trying to remember what unity felt like and failing. The horizon shifts once again, and now you find yourself riding into a whirlwind with the name Timur. He doesn't claim to be the rightful Great Khan, but that's just a technicality. Everyone knows he doesn't need to. What he claims instead is something even more dangerous, that the old Mongol world can be brought back under his boot. You arrive in Samarkand Timur's chosen capital, and it's dazzling in a way Mongol cities never quite were. Marble domes, turquoise mosaics, towering minarets that glitter in the morning sun like a skyline imagined in a dream. And just beyond all that beauty, an army. Always an army. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, is a descendant not of Genghis Khan, but of his generals. He's Turco-Mongol Muslim, born in the chaos of the Chagatai Khanate, and hungry in a way that makes other warlords nervous. He calls himself Amir Commander, and surrounds himself with the symbols of Mongol greatness banners, titles, and Genghis-style rhetoric, but with Persian administration and Islamic legitimacy. He doesn't care who's descended from who. He cares who's standing at the end of a battle. Quirky tidbit number 1. Timur kept a team of scribes whose sole job was to rewrite history as he conquered new cities, declaring that their rulers had secretly rebelled against Mongol law, even if they'd just been minding their own business for 50 years. Legal fiction, 14th century style, and his campaign's devastating. He smashes the Golden Horde at the Battle of the Terek River in 1395, reducing its cities to cinders. The once mighty Sarai is burned. The Horde's grip on the Russian principalities crumbles, leaving Moscow room to grow bolder and richer. The Mongol shadow over Russia flickers for the first time. He moves east-west everywhere. In India, he sacks Delhi so thoroughly that even the parrots stop singing. In Persia, he topples dynasties like bowling pins. The Jalayirids gone. The Chobanids crushed. The white sheep and black sheep slapped around and set to stew. Timur isn't reviving the Mongol Empire, he's creating a version of it that's meaner, sleeker, and entirely his. Historians still argue whether Timur was truly restoring Mongol greatness or simply using its image for his own power. His armies often traveled with Genghis Khan's lineage banners. His rhetoric dripped with imperial nostalgia, but his methods brutally personal. His campaigns were less about unifying the steppe and more about showcasing his unchallenged dominance. You pass through the aftermath of one such conquest, a town whose name you can't quite pronounce. The buildings still smolder and the air is thick with ash. Locals speak of pyramids of skulls built as warnings. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. They point. You don't look. Quirky tidbit. Number 2. In Damascus. Timur kidnapped all the artisans and scholars he could find, architects, calligraphers, mathematicians, and marched them back to Samarkand to decorate his capital. One captured glassblower later opened a workshop that supplied luxury goblets to Timur's entire court. Talk about a dramatic job relocation, and yet for all his brutality, Timur was not chaotic. His empire had structure. He implemented law, patronized scholars, funded madrasas, and even launched census surveys in some regions. His capital, Samarkand, became a jewel of the Islamic world, an unlikely child of Mongol legacy and Persian elegance. But he ruled by presence, not institutions. When Timur was in town, order reigned. When he left, things frayed. And he was always leaving, always off to fight someone somewhere. The empire had no backbone beyond his personality. You ride with one of his couriers, fast, lean, nervous. He explains that Timur respects no one's borders. If a wall exists, he says Timur believes it mocks him. That same day, you pass through a mountain pass where someone carved the names of Mongol Khans into the rock. Timur has added his larger with a flourish, but age comes for all conquerors. In 1405, Timur sets out to invade Ming China. You imagine him sharpening his blades, loading his elephants, rehearsing speeches about Mongol unity, and then somewhere near Otrar, he dies. Fever, old wounds, exhaustion, it doesn't matter. The storm stops. Historians will debate what would have happened if he'd reached Beijing. Would the Ming have folded? Would the Mongol banner have risen again over the Great Wall? But that story ends in the snow-covered steppe, with Timur's frozen body carried home in silence. And just like that, the empire he built begins to crack. You see it in the eyes of his sons and generals. There's no clear successor, just factions, each man hoping the others blink first. Within decades, Timur's realm has splintered into the Timurid Empire, a shadow of its former reach. Strong in culture, weak in unity. but his legacy unmistakable. He revived a kind of Mongol power even if he wrapped it in new symbols. He reignited fear across Eurasia, and in the ruins he left new powers rise: the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, descendants of Timur himself, and Muscovite Russia. You leave Samarkand beneath its brilliant domes. The city hums with life and memory. A street vendor hands you a slice of melon and whispers, "Timur made us famous." And nervous? As the sun sets, the skyline glows with tiled light, and you realize something: Timur didn't bring the Mongol Empire back. He gave it a dramatic final act. And somewhere in the dark, the steppe listens quiet, wide, and waiting for the next rider. You head north now into colder winds and flatter lands, where the trees thin out and the horizon stretches unbroken for miles. This is the domain of the Golden Horde, or rather what's left of it. Once a proud and terrifying presence from the Danube to Siberia, it now sputters like a damp campfire held together by nostalgia and not much else. The Horde had once been a masterclass in practical empire building. Its Khan's descendants of Jochi Genghis Khan's eldest son had ruled vast swaths of Eastern Europe and the Eurasian steppe. Russian princes paid tribute, trade flowed along the Volga, and Sarai glittered as a capital of tense minarets and horse-drawn diplomacy. But now in the late 1300s and into the 1400s, things are unraveling. The Horde is no longer golden, it's just tired. You pass through Sarai, or what's left of it. The streets are rutted, the markets sparse. Half the merchants have packed up and moved west toward more stable realms. The palace, once bustling with envoys from every corner of the known world, stands half abandoned. A scribe there tells you the court still issues decrees in the name of the Khan, but his eyes suggest even he's not sure which Khan anymore. That's the problem, really, too many Khans. Every few years a new contender rises, backed by a different tribal faction, issuing his own coins, commanding his own patch of steppe. Some rule from the old centers, like Sarai. Others set up makeshift capitals closer to Crimea or Kazan or Astrakhan. It's like someone turned the concept of empire into a game of musical saddles. Quirky tidbit. Number 1. In the 15th century, there were periods when up to 5 different Khans claimed to rule the Golden Horde simultaneously. Each had his own great seal. One even stamped his image on both sides of a coin just in case anyone forgot who was in charge. Spoiler, it didn't help. And while the Khans squabble, the real power quietly shifts to Moscow. You ride into the forests around the city and feel it control. Caution. Quiet strength. The Grand Prince of Moscow, once a tributary to the Horde, now collects tribute in the Horde's name and sometimes keeps it. The princes have learned from their Mongol overlords how to tax, how to build networks of loyalty, how to wait. In 1380, Prince Dmitry Donskoy had the audacity to challenge Mongol authority directly at the Battle of Kulikovo, defeating one of the Horde's generals. Though the Horde would retaliate, the spell had been broken. Moscow had drawn Mongol blood and survived. A message was sent not just to the Khans, but to the Russian people the steppe no longer ruled unopposed. Historians still argue whether this battle truly marked the decline of the Horde's power in Russia, or if it was more symbolic than strategic. What's clear, though, is that from this point on, Moscow's rise becomes inevitable. And the Horde. It begins to rust. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some Golden Horde rulers in this period took to hiring Italian and Genoese advisors to handle their diplomacy, especially with Crimea and the Black Sea ports. One Khan even considered converting to Catholicism, if it meant Genoa would help him retake Sarai. The plan fell through when his allies poisoned him. Business negotiations were a little more intense back then. By the mid 1400s, the Golden Horde begins to splinter into successor states Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and the Nogai Horde. Each one claims to be the true heir. Each one tries to revive some spark of Genghis's legacy. But they're more like embers than flames. You walk the streets of Kazan where Tatar princes rule the city, still thriving with trade and culture. The people speak Turkic, pray in Arabic, and still ride horses like their ancestors. But the air feels different. There's a sense of being watched by Muscovy, by the Lithuanians, by the growing weight of history. Meanwhile, Crimea strikes a strange bargain. The Crimean Khanate becomes a client state of the Ottoman Empire, trading full independence for Ottoman protection and access to the Black Sea economy. Some might call it clever, others desperate. The once mighty horde has become a family tree with too many branches and no roots. No one can quite agree when it ended because it didn't really fall, it just faded. A few battles here, a failed treaty there, and eventually no one noticed it had stopped calling itself golden. You sit beside the Volga watching the barges pass. A boy herds sheep past a ruined yam station. Somewhere upstream, a Russian tax collector takes bribes in a language that still has Mongol words tucked inside. The horde may be gone, but its fingerprints linger on trade, on law, even on language. And Moscow remembers everything. The time of the horse lords is ending. The world now moves by boat, by bureaucracy, by book. But as you ride out into the steppe one more time, the wind picks up. Just for a moment, it sounds like hooves. You follow the trail south now, slipping through the dust of old caravans and the whispers of vanished cities. The roads grow fainter here and the names change more quickly. Places once called by Mongol titles now answer to local dialects, to Persian poetry, to Turkic chants sung around smoky hearths. The empire has fragmented, yes, but its deepest wounds are economic. You cross into the heart of Yuan China again, what was once the shining model of Mongol sophistication, now riddled with contradictions. Back in the days of Kublai Khan, there had been a dream to turn a conqueror's saddlebag into a government desk. That dream had a currency. Literally. Enter paper money. When Kublai first introduced it on a massive scale, the idea was revolutionary. No heavy metal coins. No sacks of copper. Just standardized notes issued by the state light to carry, easy to count, and backed by the full authority of the Khan. For a while it worked like magic, but magic, as you know by now, has limits, especially when backed by hope instead of silver. You pass a money changer's stall in Hangzhou. He sits slouched behind a table littered with useless notes, rectangles of ink-stained mulberry bark, stamped with seals that haven't meant anything in decades. Good for tax payments, they once said, accepted throughout the empire. Now they're used to patch leaks in roofs or folded into children's toys. The yuan's economy began collapsing under its own weight in the early 1300s. War costs, famine plague, all drained the treasury. The response: print more money, then more. And then, well, you can guess how that goes. Quirky tidbit number 1. In some parts of China during the late Yuan period, merchants began refusing paper money entirely, preferring bolts of silk or sacks of grain as payment. One savvy market even minted their own token sticks out of carved bamboo, redeemable only within the town. Local currency before it was cool. Inflation skyrocketed. Confidence plummeted. In major cities, bread cost 10 times what it had a decade before. Peasants already crushed by tax collectors simply stopped bothering to grow surplus. Artisans buried their tools. Trade slowed and crime picked up the slack. You speak to a tea merchant whose family has owned a stall since Kublai's days. He sighs. Back then, he says, a single note could buy enough rice to feed your village for a week. Now it buys a cup of boiled water. He laughs bitterly. Without the cup, and when economic trust crumbles, political authority isn't far behind. This wasn't just a Chinese story. The same tale played out across the crumbling Khanates. In Persia, the Ilkhanata's economy, once powered by silk spice and tax revenues from an empire-wide census, collapsed after Abu Sa'id's death. No heir meant no stability. No stability meant no taxes. No taxes meant unpaid soldiers. You see where this goes. Quirky tidbit number 2. After the Ilkhanate, fractured rival rulers tried launching their own currencies with slogans like coin of justice or token of prosperity. One such coin had a typo so egregious that scribes used it as a joke for years. No one knows if the ruler ever realized he'd minted the word peach instead of peace. Trade routes suffered too. The famed Silk Road, once patrolled by Mongol forces and dotted with way stations, became increasingly dangerous. Bandits returned. Whole stretches of road became unofficially closed. Caravans grew smaller, their guards more numerous. The magic of Mongol logistics, once admired by even their enemies, was fading fast. Historians still argue whether the collapse of Mongol paper money systems was a unique case of mismanagement or an inevitable failure given the era's limited economic theory. But the lesson was clear. Conquest might get you land, but it doesn't get you economic literacy. And so with coinage, unreliable merchants turned local. Regional markets became insulated. City-states leaned into self-sufficiency. The dream of a connected Eurasia, a world of shared goods and swift exchanges, began to fragment. You cross through a town that once boomed as a relay stop. Now it's eerily still. The old Yam post office has been converted into a grain warehouse. The horses are gone. The signal flags are faded. A child plays with what used to be a courier's leather satchel, now just a toy bag with broken buckles. But there are survivors of this collapse. Quiet ones. The banking families of Samarkand. The merchant clans in Kashgar. The Jewish traders of Crimea. They adapt, hoarding silver, trading in weight, not promises. Some will survive this age and build dynasties of their own. You sip weak tea with one such merchant who shows you a worn ledger filled with careful Chinese, Arabic, and Persian notations. We don't trust Khans, he says. But we trust salt, we trust pepper, we trust camels. He taps the ledger. Numbers don't lie, rulers do. You can't argue with that. As you leave the town, bell rings not to signal trade, but a water shortage. The fields are dry, the granaries nearly empty, and no imperial messenger will arrive to fix it. Because the empire no longer knows this place exists. The silence of financial ruin is not thunderous, it is soft. The absence of coin in a beggar's bowl, the stillness of a marketplace at noon, the flutter of paper money drifting down a deserted alley. And just like that, you realize no matter how great the army, no matter how fast the horse, an empire that can't feed its people or pay its soldiers is already dead. It just hasn't fallen over yet. You drift back eastward past burned fields and broken way stations and reach the remains of Dadu once more, or as it's called now by the new rulers, Beijing. The Yuan dynasty has been swept away, but echoes of it still linger in the city's bones. You walk the same courtyards past the same carved dragons, but now under banners of red silk bearing the Ming emblem. And somewhere deep inside the palace walls, the final Mongol emperors are still talked about, but mostly as a warning. The Yuan rulers after Kublai were many things: ambitious, indulgent, and increasingly incompetent. As you explore the archives of a nervous court historian, you piece together a parade of emperors who drifted further and further from their origins. Some were weak, some were cruel. A few barely seemed aware they were ruling anything at all. After Kublai came his grandson Timur Khan, decent, dutiful, but unimaginative. He tried to hold things together. It worked for a while. But then came Kublai Khan, whose name means big, but whose policies were anything but. Quirky tidbit number 1. Kublai tried to reinvent the economy by introducing a dual currency system, one for Mongols, one for everyone else. Within 6 months, nobody wanted either, and a black market sprang up that used salted fish as currency. Inflation was delicious and unavoidable. The Yuan court devolved into palace intrigue. Eunuchs rose to power, generals became warlords, and emperors vanished under mysterious circumstances, often at the age of 18 or 19. If there was a way to mismanage an empire, the late Yuan rulers tried it. Twice. The final decades were a blur of disasters: peasants rising in rebellion, floods consuming farmland, generals ignoring orders. The Red Turbans, who had once been dismissed as an oddball cult with too many matching hats, were now storming cities and killing governors. You sit beneath a faded mural in a northern fortress, watching soldiers argue over whether the next caravan will bring reinforcements or just more paper money. The commander shrugs. Either way, he says we'll be fighting by next week. And then comes Togon Timur, the last true Yuan emperor. He takes the throne young and stays long, too long, many would say. He is eccentric, deeply religious, and increasingly paranoid. He trusts no one. He surrounds himself with fortune tellers and astrologers. He rarely leaves the inner palace. When provinces revolt, he responds by meditating. When generals defect, he sends poems. Historians still argue whether Togon Timur was a tragic figure, an overwhelmed ruler in an impossible situation, or just genuinely bad at his job. Some suggest he tried to reform the system. Others claim he barely understood how the system worked. Either way, as the Ming army advanced in 1368, he fled north, abandoning Beijing without a fight. Quirky tidbit number 2. According to one court diary, the emperor left behind not just the throne, but his entire wardrobe, including ceremonial robes, hats, and golden chopsticks. The Ming reportedly put them on display like trophies in a victory parade. Imperial dignity boxed and labeled. You follow Togon Timur's path into exile, winding through dusty mountain passes into the Mongolian heartlands. Here among the hills and herds, the northern Yuan dynasty flickers into life more a ghost than a government. They still call themselves emperors. They still claim all of China, but few believe them. Even fewer listen. The new Ming rulers rebuild the capital, reinforce the Great Wall, and push Mongol influence back into the steppe. But they don't erase everything. Yuan law codes are revised, not burned. Yuan calendars are edited, not discarded. Mongol-style archery competitions continue, even if now hosted by Chinese nobles trying not to look impressed. You ride with a group of scholars sent north to retrieve old documents from the abandoned Yuan libraries. One finds a scroll that reads, "The world is as wide as a horse's gallop." He folds it gently. Now it's about as wide as a tax form, he mutters. And yet the steppe does not forget. In Mongolia, the remnants of the Yuan line regroup. They still hold the Orkhon Valley, build gurs, and tell stories by the fire about the days when their ancestors ruled from Korea to Kiev. Children memorize the names of the Khans. Old warriors polish swords they haven't used in decades. The fire of conquest has dimmed, but the memory still burns. You pass through Karakorum, the ancient capital. It's quiet now. The great palace is gone. A few stone turtles remain, once guardians, now half buried in dirt and sheep droppings. A boy runs past chasing a goat. He doesn't know what empire once stood here. But his grandmother does. She tells you we ruled the world. Then we lost it. But the wind still knows our name. There's a quiet pride here, even in decline. The Mongols may have lost China, Persia, and Russia, but they still hold the memory. the titles, the bloodline, and occasionally they raid again just enough to remind the neighbors they're not quite extinct. You sit on a hillside one evening overlooking the plains. A herder plays a horsehead fiddle. The notes stretch into the sky like a morning song. Somewhere an old man is telling a child about Kublai Batu, Hulagu, and Genghis, as if they'll ride again someday. The final Yuan emperors were weak, but the idea of Mongol power that's harder to kill. And in the rustle of the grass you hear the past whisper back. The steppe stretches around you like a sea without waves, endless, windblown, and quiet. But beneath that quiet lies the heartbeat of something enduring. You've seen the cities fall. You've watched the thrones crumble. But out here in the grasslands of Mongolia, something older than empire still breathes. This is the land of the northern Yuan, the final ember of a once mighty fire. After Toghon Timur fled Beijing and the Ming took the heart of China, his descendants tried to maintain their claim from afar. They still called themselves emperors. They still performed the ancient rites. They still named their sons after Genghis and claimed descent without blinking. But their empire now consisted of yurts, horses, and hope. You find yourself among them camping with a clan whose patriarch claims direct lineage to Kublai's third cousin. He invites you to drink Arag-fermented mare's milk and listen to the stories passed down since before the fall of Dadu. They remember every name, every banner, every battle. And yet for all this reverence, the cracks are visible. The myth of Mongol unity, once a source of strength, has become a fiction recited out of habit rather than belief. Quirky tidbit number 1. Some of the northern Yuan khans continue to issue royal decrees on silk banners, even when their realm extended no farther than the next hill. One decree from the late 1400s orders all subjects to bow toward the east every morning to honor the memory of the great capital. Most locals just bowed toward their cooking pots. The truth is, even at the height of its power, the Mongol Empire wasn't as unified as it seemed. It had always been more of a patchwork, a fabric stitched from conquest, marriages, and fear. The Khanates functioned like loosely affiliated franchises. The Great Khan might have held theoretical authority, but in practice, each branch of the family did its own thing. Back in the 13th century, Genghis had tried to impose discipline, merit-based promotions, strict military codes, collective responsibility for crimes. But once the empire grew, that structure stretched thin. Distant cousins claimed autonomy. Generals became governors. And over time, the idea of one empire under one Khan drifted into a ceremonial notion rather than a functional reality. Historians still argue whether the empire ever was truly unified, or whether it simply looked that way to its enemies, who only saw the thunder of hooves and not the squabbling behind the curtain. Some scholars suggest that even Genghis himself had trouble keeping his sons from infighting. Others argue that the illusion of unity was the point. If you believed the Mongols were one unstoppable force, it didn't matter if they weren't. Quirky tidbit number 2. A letter from the Golden Horde to the Yuan court once began with 20 lines of honorifics declaring loyalty to the one sky-blessed Khan of all men, and ended with a request to please stop sending tax collectors into their markets. A polite rebellion paper-wrapped. You begin to realize this empire, like so many others, was made of stories. The story of Genghis the Invincible. The story of the Silk Road that could never be broken. The story of a world that once feared a man on horseback more than any storm. And when the reality faltered, the stories endured. Even now, centuries after the fall, these stories shape the steppe. You share a meal with a shaman near Lake Krovskol. She shows you a leather pouch containing the hair of an ancestor's horse and a scrap of old Mongol script, illegible, faded sacred. This, she says, reminds us of who we were, and who they still are in some sense. But the practicalities have changed. trade routes have shifted. The Silk Road has been rerouted, now safer along southern paths or by sea. The Chinese wall has grown taller. Russian muskets are replacing Mongol arrows. The steppe is no longer feared, it is bypassed. The Khans of the northern Yuan continue into the 15th and even 16th centuries. Some are wise. Others are reckless. One marries his sister. Another is killed by lightning. Their reigns are marked more by internal clan feuds than external conquest. Occasionally, a bold prince raids into Ming territory, reminding the world that the steppe still has teeth. But mostly the empire's last phases lived in memory, not expansion. And yet there is something noble here. A stubborn dignity. You see it in the way a writer brushes dust from a family crest, in the way children still learn the old songs, in the way an old man traces Genghis's family tree in the dirt with a stick, even though no one asked. The empire may have never been perfectly united, but for a time everyone believed it was. And that belief reshaped the world. You rest beneath a starlit sky wrapped in a woolen blanket that smells faintly of horses. Nearby, a woman sings an ancient lullaby in a tongue older than any city you've visited. It's a soft, sorrowful tune, half mourning, half celebration. You don't understand the words, but you understand the feeling. Out here where the roads vanish and maps lose their grip, the Mongol Empire lives on not in banners or borders, but in memory, myth, and marrow. And sometimes that's enough. The sun is low again, slipping toward the western hills, and your journey brings you now to the edge of the Yuan's old capital, though not the physical city of Dadu, but the idea of it. For tonight, you aren't watching a coronation or riding with messengers. You're here to witness an ending. The fall of Mongol rule in China wasn't loud. It wasn't a grand finale of war horns and fire. It was in many ways a slow unraveling, like the last strands of a bowstring fraying until there's just silence. You walk the stone streets of Dadu after the Ming takeover. The markets buzz with activity again, but the signs have changed. The Mongol banners are gone. The imperial guards now wear bright red. The drums beat differently. The names of the emperors carved into the gates have been scratched out or replaced. No one here talks about the Yuan much. It's not that they were forgotten, it's just easier for everyone to pretend they never belonged. The last Mongol emperor to rule from the capital Toghon Timur had fled in disgrace. His court had disintegrated around him. One minister poisoned, another defected. A third simply disappeared with the treasury. The guards stopped answering orders. The palace gates creaked open, not from siege, but from abandonment. Quirky tidbit number 1. When Ming forces entered Dadu in 1368, they reportedly found a royal pantry filled with exotic animals, peacocks, snow leopards, parrots from Burma. The new emperor allegedly released them as a gesture of renewal. Locals later complained about leopards in their gardens. Now, in the years after the fall, the people begin rebuilding. But beneath the new structures, Yuan foundations remain. Literally. Ming buildings stand atop Mongol blueprints. Roads, canals, and even administrative zones keep their Yuan outlines. They rename things, but they don't truly start over. You see it in the city's rhythm. The tax system adapted from Yuan innovations. The military household registry based on Mongol systems. Even the bureaucratic language includes terms borrowed from the steppe. And yet there's discomfort. The Yuan dynasty was foreign, Mongol, alien to many Han Chinese. So even though it had ruled for nearly a century, many preferred to act as though it had been an interruption, not a chapter. Historians still argue whether the Yuan left a lasting cultural impact on China. Some say it was just a violent interlude. Others point to changes in art administration and trade that only blossomed because of Mongol experimentation and openness to outsiders. There's truth in both views. Quirky tidbit number 2. The Ming court initially banned the Mongol game of Shagai dice, made from sheep knuckle bones, calling it a barbarian distraction. Within a generation, it was back in fashion at court banquets, especially when played for bets involving poetry recitation. Court life is weird like that. You wander out into the countryside surrounding Beijing. The old relay stations are empty now. Horses no longer wait in tethered rows. But a farmer tells you that sometimes at night his grandfather says he still hears the thunder of hooves, distant, echoing, unreal. The Mongol dream didn't end all at once. The northern Yuan dynasty continued far into the 15th century and beyond, ruling Mongolia proper and occasionally raiding the Ming border. But they would never again sit in the dragon throne. That was gone. What you feel now is the closing of a door. Quiet. No ceremony. Just the subtle change in the wind as history shifts direction. You pass through a village built over an old Yuan military encampment. No one there knows the story, but they still find arrowheads in the fields after every heavy rain. They treat them like fossils, curious, ancient, anonymous. In another town, an old monk tends a shrine once visited by Kublai Khan. He doesn't talk much about it, but when pressed he murmurs, "They were kings for a time, but the mountain does not kneel forever." The Ming now rule with Confucian ideals, strict legalism, and a resurgent cultural pride. But somewhere beneath the surface, the land still remembers. A road curves slightly to follow the old Yam path. A bridge retains its Yuan masonry under Ming decorations. A farmer's house has a cellar built from bricks looted from the northern palace walls. The Yuan dynasty is gone, but like sediment layered into the soil, it's part of the foundation. And sometimes when you sit quietly in the shade of a pine near the wall of a ruined Yuan temple, you feel it, not the power, not the terror, but the imprint. A wind crosses the steppe, and for just a moment you wonder if it still carries the scent of horse sweat and empire. Then it passes, and the silence returns. The road curves west again, and your boots find the dustier paths less traveled, less certain. Not all who came into contact with the Mongols were their enemies. Some were their survivors. Others became something stranger, echoes in forgotten corners. You walk into the highlands of Afghanistan where the Mongol presence once thundered through mountain passes like a storm. Now it lingers in the silence. Crumbled watchtowers, a yurt frame half buried in stone, the skeletal outline of what was once a Mongol garrison, its walls now used to pen goats. You find yourself in Bamiyan, a valley once known for its towering Buddhas before Hulagu's men marched through with iron and fire. And yet, in the wake of that violence, they left behind not just ruins, but structures, systems, bones of empire that would last longer than their banners. Quirky tidbit number 1. Archaeologists have found Yuan-style bricks in the floor of a caravanserai in Ghazni bricks, stamped with Chinese characters over Persian inscriptions. No one knows if they were brought through trade conquest or the whims of a bored merchant. Maybe all three. Here in Afghanistan and across Central Asia, the Mongols built things: roads, forts, gardens, canals. Many of them fell into ruin, but others were adopted, reshaped, repurposed. A stone bridge designed by a Mongol engineer might now serve Afghan shepherds. A ruined Mongol mosque might have become a Sufi shrine. You see these layers and you realize destruction wasn't the only legacy. As the Mongol Empire fell apart in the great centers, China, Persia, Russia, its fragments took root in places far from the spotlight. You arrive at a village where the local dialect contains strange Mongol loanwords terms for tools, animals, seasons. The people don't know the word's origins. They've simply always been there, like seeds carried on the wind. Historians still argue whether Mongol influence in these peripheral areas was deep or shallow. Some suggest it faded quickly after their armies withdrew. Others argue that even brief occupation left behind trade routes, intermarriages, and administrative habits that shaped local history long after the Khans forgot those places existed. Quirky tidbit number 2. In parts of northern Afghanistan, horsemen still practice a style of mounted archery called chabuk, which some believe is descended from Mongol cavalry techniques. It's no longer a military skill, it's sport now, but the precision, the speed, the strange curved bows they whisper of another time. You travel deeper into the mountains where tribes remember the Mongols as both demons and lawgivers. Some tales speak of giants on horseback, others of Khans who granted tax relief to goat herders in bad seasons. You suspect both may be true. The Mongols could build and burn in the same breath. In one village, you sleep in a house built with stones from an old Mongol fort. The family offers you non-sweet tea and a place by the fire. The grandfather taps his cane and says, "My ancestors watched the Khan's horses pass this valley. They didn't speak our language, but their horses understood the land." You nod. It makes sense. The Mongols may have left, but they walked deep into memory. This isn't just true in Afghanistan. Across the broader Islamic world, the aftershocks of Mongol conquest helped reshape the map. The fall of Baghdad in 1258, though a generation earlier, left a crater in Islamic authority. But from that crater, new centers rose: Cairo, Samarkand, Isfahan. Mongol commanders who settled in these regions became local rulers, intermarried, and gradually adopted Islam. Their descendants would eventually help forge the foundations for future empires: the Timurids, the Safavids, even the Mughals of India. It's strange to think about how an empire built by shamanistic horsemen from the steppe helped clear the way for a flourishing of Islamic art, architecture, and scholarship. But history is like that. Messy, roundabout, poetic in the least poetic ways. You descend from the mountain, passes into valleys filled with ruined caravan posts, their walls weathered but still standing. They mark a world that once bustled with long-distance trade, and for a while, because of the Mongols, it worked safely, swiftly, globally. That world is gone now, but the skeleton remains. In one of the crumbling posts, someone has scratched a name in the wall, a script that looks part Uyghur, part Arabic. You run your hand across the stone and feel the residue of motion, of people who didn't belong here but passed through anyway, left behind their language, their horses, their legends. You light a small fire and sit in the archway watching the stars wheel overhead. In the distance, a dog barks, a child laughs, a cart creaks down a slope that was once part of the Royal Mongol Road. It's quieter now, softer, but not gone. Because while the empire fell in palaces and capitals, it endured in forgotten places. And here in the highlands and valleys of Afghanistan, you realize the Mongol Empire didn't just die, it transformed. Like the mountains it once tried to conquer, it changed shape. And remained. The wind over the steppes tastes different now, sharper, almost expectant. You're moving through lands where the Mongols once thundered past banners flapping arrows drawn. But these days, the only banners still raised are religious ones. Something strange has happened across the remnants of the empire. The swords have dulled. The war drums have fallen silent. And in their place, another force spreads through the fractured Khanate's faith. In the beginning, the Mongols had little interest in religion, at least not in enforcing one. Genghis himself had followed Tengrism, a shamanistic belief rooted in sky worship and ancestor spirits. He respected other faiths, though. In fact, one of his early policies declared complete religious freedom across the empire. A practical move, really more believers meant more taxpayers. But now with the empire fractured and localized, each khanate begins to find its own religious identity. And those identities don't always align. You arrive in Samarkand where the call to prayer echoes from tall minarets. Once a city of mixed beliefs and Mongol warlords, it's now firmly Islamic. The mosques are built atop former garrisons. The Quran has replaced the great Khan's decrees in the courts. The conversion here was gradual but firm, especially under Timur's reign. Further west in the Ilkhanate, the shift was more dramatic. Hulagu, founder of that line, had been a Buddhist and a destroyer of the Abbasid Caliphate. But just 2 generations later, his descendants embraced Islam fully. Some scholars think it was political Islam offered connection to the local Persian elites. Others argue that the trauma of the Black Death drove people toward belief. Either way, the Ilkhanate's rulers built mosques, studied Islamic law, and rebranded themselves as defenders of the faith. Quirky tidbit number 1. The Ilkhan Ghazan, upon converting to Islam, issued a royal decree banning the consumption of pork and the drinking of alcohol, 2 staples of Mongol culture. His officers obeyed for exactly 3 days before quietly ignoring him. Reform is hard when your army likes barbecue and beer. Meanwhile, in the Chagatai Khanate, things got complicated. Some rulers converted, others didn't. And some swung back and forth, depending on who was winning the civil war that week. The eastern half of the Khanate leaned Buddhist for a time. The western half eventually settled into Islam, but not without resistance. You stop in Kashgar, once a node of the Silk Road. A mullah tells you that some of the old laws still reflect Mongol customs, especially in inheritance and punishment. We believe he says softly, but we remember too. Historians still argue whether the Mongols' religious shifts weakened or strengthened their rule. The original strategy, religious neutrality, had fostered tolerance and diverse administration. But later Khans who aligned too tightly with a single faith risked alienating the multi-ethnic populations they ruled. In the Ilkhanate, the forced Islamization of administrative structures led to the exile of many Nestorian Christians and Buddhists. In the Golden Horde, some Orthodox Christians were forced to pay extra taxes until later Khans reversed the policy for political convenience. Quirky tidbit number 2. One Golden Horde Khan. Burqa was so devout a Muslim that he nearly went to war with his cousin Hulagu for destroying Baghdad. He also reportedly sent gold to Makkah to fund renovations of the Kaaba, perhaps the only time in history that a Mongol tax helped repair the holiest site in Islam. And yet not all Khanates followed the same script. In the Yuan dynasty, Buddhism flourished. Kublai Khan sponsored Tibetan lamas, built temples, and even dabbled in Taoist rituals when it suited him. His court became a strange cocktail of Confucian officials, Buddhist monks, and Mongol shamans. For a time it worked. But later, Yuan emperors leaned heavily into religious pageantry, often at the expense of practical governance. Prayers were offered for rain when what the farmers really needed was tax relief. You pass a monastery outside of Beijing, now repurposed by the Ming. The carvings still show lions, lotus flowers, and clouds swirling in Mongol patterns. A monk sweeping the stairs tells you, this place was sacred to them. We keep it clean, just in case they come back. Faith didn't just divide the empire, it also became a symbol of legitimacy. As the empire splintered, Khans used religion to claim they were the rightful heirs. I am blessed by the sky god. I protect the true faith. The prophet guides my rule. It became less about belief and more about branding. And yet for all the religious competition, you find quiet moments of harmony. In Crimea, where the Mongol Crimean Khanate still limps along under Ottoman protection, you attend a market where Muslims, Christians, and Jews haggle side by side. A muezzin calls from one minaret, a church bell rings from across the plaza, and a Jewish merchant counts silver with no concern for who rules this week. You wonder, maybe the Mongol policy of tolerance wasn't a passing phase. Maybe it left a subtle legacy, one that outlived the Khans themselves. Out in the steppe, you camp beneath stars that once watched over Genghis Khan's riders. Your host, a herder, tells you his family still whispers prayers to the eternal blue sky at sunrise, just as their ancestors did. But he also fasts during Ramadan and wears a cross around his neck, a gift, he says, from a traveler who saved his life in a blizzard. You can believe many things, he says, and still ride in the same direction. You sip tea warmed by fire and feel the strange truth of that. For all their fragmentation, for all their religious swings, the Mongols, through their openness and their reach, carved out a world where belief could move and shift and mix. Even if the empire is gone, that spiritual legacy, complex, contradictory, oddly graceful, still wanders the roads it left behind. You rise before dawn and step into a world still cloaked in dew. The stars have not yet faded. Somewhere in the distance, a herder sings to his animals in a language with pieces of Mongolian still embedded like old coins in soil. Today, you're not tracing battlefields or following trade routes. You're chasing the fragile scaffolding of an idea, one that once held a continent together, the myth of Mongol unity. At its peak, the Mongol Empire looked unified, a single banner stretching from the Pacific to the Danube, a single family born of Genghis Khan's line, ruling across khanates that bore his name with pride. A world stitched together by conquest, trade, fear, and horses. But look closer, and the seams were always visible. Even during Genghis Khan's lifetime, the empire was less a coherent nation, and more a collection of powerful clans bound by shared purpose and extreme charisma. After his death, that purpose remained for a while. But loyalty to the family tree proved weaker than loyalty to Goldland or revenge. You stop at a ruined yam station. The stone is crumbling, the once efficient relay system silent. This post once linked Chagatai's cities to Kublai's court and Hulagu's war camps to the Golden Horde's outposts. But even when the couriers rode without rest, the Khanates weren't truly in sync. They fought, constantly. Politely at first, disagreements over borders taxes, who insulted whose envoy. Then more openly. Full-on wars broke out between the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde. The Chagatai and the Yuan glared across the desert. Unity more like tense group projects with too many leaders and not enough trust. Historians still argue whether the empire ever functioned as a true federation, or if that image was mostly smoke and well-fed horses. One camp sees the Mongol world as an early model of decentralized cooperation, a blueprint for globalization before the word existed. Another sees it as a temporary illusion made possible by speed terror and a string of charismatic warlords. Quirky tidbit number 1. When the Ilkhans tried to arrange marriages with Yuan princesses to strengthen unity, it took years for responses to arrive and often longer to sort out dowry arguments. One Yuan envoy reportedly died of old age while waiting for permission to cross Central Asia. The marriage never happened. Even titles began to mean less. Great Khan was once sacred. Genghis, then Ogadai, then Munka, then Kublai. But after Kublai, it became mostly ceremonial. The other Khanates stopped showing up to the Kurultai, the Great Council. Some didn't even send excuses. Others just declared themselves the real Great Khan and dared anyone to argue. You reach a crossroads where 4 banners once flew, one for each major Khanate. Nothing remains now but a single stone post, etched with names in multiple scripts: Chinese, Uyghur, Arabic, Cyrillic. You trace the letters with your finger and feel how far the unity once stretched and how thin it was even then. Quirky tidbit number 2. The Golden Horde once tried to mail a live falcon to the Yuan court as a symbol of unity. It arrived dead. The Yuan responded with the gift of ceramics and no note. Unity, in case you're wondering, didn't improve. And yet, for all their squabbles, for all the wars and betrayals, the idea of unity persisted. It was powerful. The name Genghis still carried weight. Merchants still believed in the Pax Mongolica long after it was functionally dead. Diplomats invoked Genghis's lineage in letters decades after his grandchildren stopped speaking to each other. You sit with a merchant in Tbilisi, Georgia, a man whose ancestors once paid tribute to the Ilkhanate and later traded under the protection of the Golden Horde. They were never one, he says, sipping plum wine. But they made us believe they were. And for a while, that belief was enough. That's the strange trick of empire, even disunited. Even broken, its shell can function. The memory of Mongol unity kept roads open longer, kept envoys moving, kept local rulers pretending. Like a ghost army marching long after death. In Karakorum, the once proud capital of the empire, you find a stone turtle. It once stood at the entrance to a great hall of governance and glory. Now it sits alone, a shepherd's child, climbing on its back, unaware of what it once represented. The empire is gone. But the myth of its unity lingers, especially among those who wish it would return. Across Central Asia, kings and khans for centuries to come will claim descent from Genghis. Not because they were his direct heirs, but because the idea of a single Mongol world still carried weight. Even the mighty Timur, you recall, leaned heavily on this myth. He never claimed to be Great Khan, but he said he was restoring Genghis's order. His flags bore Mongol motifs. His laws referenced Mongol codes. The reality didn't matter. The story did. And here you are, riding across empty grasslands under a sky too big for one country. The stars above watched it all, the rise, the splintering, the myths. Maybe they remember better than the historians. As the night sets in, you sit by your fire. You think about how the world believed in Mongol unity long after it ceased to exist. How belief shaped reality. And you wonder, how many other empires live longer in imagination than they ever did in truth? You ride now into the open grasslands of Mongolia, the true homeland. The air is thinner, the horizon wider, and the silence older. No walls, no palaces, no cities, just rolling steppe herds of horses and the smell of sagebrush and smoke. Here where it all began, the Mongol Empire never truly ended. The other Khanats fell, were absorbed, or rebranded. But in this land, the legacy was not just a memory, it became a living identity. These are the lands of the northern Yuan, the final shard of the once global machine. After Toghon Timur's flight from Dadu, his descendants returned to the steppe, regrouped and ruled smaller, poorer, but defiantly Mongol. They built no glittering capitals. They erected no new walls. But they held to something stronger than structure, a sense of who they were. You pass a group of riders training for a local Nadam festival, a traditional celebration of archery, wrestling, and horse racing that dates back to the days of the first Khans. The bows are shorter now, the arrows tipped in rubber, but the spirit remains. An elder nods to you and says, "We may not rule the world, but our children still ride like we could." Quirky tidbit number 1. The title of Great Khan continued to be used in Mongolia for centuries after the Yuan fell. One Khandayan Khan in the 15th century even unified much of the steppe, again claiming that the spirit of Genghis had whispered in his dreams. His court was a felt tent, his army made of teenagers and shepherds, but for a while he brought order back to the grass. Here the myth of Mongol greatness wasn't ceremonial, it was familial. Clan elders could trace lineage back to Genghis. Children were told bedtime stories of battles at the Kalka River. Shamans still invoked the eternal blue sky. Horses were still more valuable than gold. And yet the world changed. China built walls. Russia grew teeth. Guns replaced bows. The Mongol riders were still fast, still fierce, but no longer unstoppable. You sit with a local chieftain in the 1600s under the clear stars. He tells you of how the Oirats Western Mongol tribes rose to power, challenging the old Genghisid lines. The Dzungars, a branch of the Oirats, even built their own empire stretching from Tibet to Siberia. Mongol power flickered again. Not in China, not in Persia, but here in the cold wind. Historians still argue whether this later Mongol revival, Oirat Dzungar or otherwise, was a continuation of Genghis's dream or an entirely separate beast. The lines had blurred. The banners were different, but the fire was familiar. Quirky tidbit number 2. One Mongol noble in the 17th century petitioned the Qing dynasty, who now ruled China, to allow annual horseback pilgrimages to Karakoram, framed not as a political move but as a ritual of ancestral memory. The Qing agreed so long as the riders stayed under 50 and brought no weapons. They did, except for knives and axes and war songs. Some habits are hard to break. You see the tensions of modernity pressing in from all sides. Buddhist lamas arrive from Tibet, blending Mongol spirituality with monastic discipline. Chinese governors negotiate border rights. Russian Cossacks press from the north, offering trade and demanding tribute. The Mongols adapt not by becoming less Mongol, but by becoming more selective about which traditions to keep and which ones to wrap in silk and memory. You follow a river that once marked the edge of a Khan's domain. It's now a grazing ground. The horses are thinner, the yurts more patched. But no one here believes they're part of a fallen empire. They believe they are what remains. And that belief is powerful. You visit a small shrine where a Genghisid standard, tattered and sun-bleached, is still raised once a year on the birthday of the great Khan. Boys wrestle in the dust. Girls race ponies down the valley. The prize is a felt hat and a song sung in your honor. You ask an old woman why they still celebrate. Her eyes crinkle. Because we remember when the world spoke our name with awe, she says, and because the wind has not forgotten. In the end, legacy doesn't require power, it requires presence. And in Mongolia, the presence of empire is everywhere. In the language, the landscape, the lullabies. The empire no longer rules, but it shapes. You climb a hill above Karakoram where stones mark ancient camps. You can almost see the lines of tents stretching toward the horizon, hear the creak of saddle leather, the rustle of silk, tributes the thud of hooves. It's quiet now, but not empty, because the Mongol Empire may be gone, but Mongolia still remembers. The wind carries you further now into a place that is neither map nor memory, a strange space where borders blur and history softens into legend. You're moving not through the Mongol Empire as it was, but through its last breath. It didn't end with a bang. There was no final siege, no official declaration, no tombstone with a date chiseled into granite. The empire that once stretched across continents dissolved not like a building collapsing, but like smoke thinning into the sky. You find yourself in the late 1600s, where scattered khanates linger like embers. The Crimean Khanate, technically descended from the Golden Horde, still claims to be part of the imperial tradition, but now serves the Ottoman sultans. The Dzungar Khanate, a Western Mongol power, rises in Central Asia with ambitious dreams. but few outside recognize them as rightful heirs of Genghis. The northern Yuan still holds sway in the high plains, but even they now negotiate more than they conquer. You meet a scholar in Urga, modern-day Ulaanbaatar. He wears a mix of robes, some Chinese, some Tibetan, some distinctly Mongol. His calligraphy is flawless and his voice low. We still invoke the name of Genghis, he says, but mostly to remind ourselves that we are not ghosts. Quirky tidbit number 1. Even into the 19th century, Mongolian chronicles continued to include Genghis Khan's name at the top of royal genealogies, no matter how distant or tenuous the connection. A prince with only 1/8 Genghisid blood would be introduced as born of the line of the sky-blessed emperor. When in doubt, claim the cloud. You travel west into the Russian steppes, where once the Golden Horde ruled by terror and tribute, now the Tsardom of Russia spreads using many of the same tools: census records, postal roads, military conscription. Even the word Tsar from Caesar echoes imperial ambition, but its structure deeply influenced by Mongol precedent. Moscow learned from its conquerors, and then slowly absorbed them. Historians still argue whether the rise of Russia was a continuation of Mongol administrative genius or a reaction against it. The answer, as usual, is both. The Russians adopted Mongol taxation tribute systems and even legal concepts. Then they erased the Mongol names and claimed them as native innovations. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some Russian noble families in the 1700s quietly bragged about descent from Mongol generals, not publicly, of course, but in family records and dinner party gossip. My great-grandfather served under Beitu Khan. One noble would whisper right before asking to borrow your hunting falcons. And still further east in China, the Mongol legacy endures under the Qing dynasty. Though Manchu the Qing rulers maintain Mongolian banners, fund Buddhist temples on the steppe, and tolerate Mongol noble titles so long as they pay tribute and keep their arrows pointed away from Beijing. In this late stage, Mongol identity becomes both flexible and stubborn. In some places, it's a cultural memory, a song, a saddle style, a festival day. In others, it's a tool of diplomacy used to claim authority or negotiate marriage. And in a few rare corners, it's still a fire flickering but not gone. You return once more to the site of Karakorum, the first imperial capital. There's no palace left, just stones, weeds, and the occasional archaeologist brushing dust from what might have been a threshold. A young monk walks by with a goat. You ask him what this place means. He says it's where the world once listened to us, and where we still listen to ourselves. The empire's gone, but the story? The story continues. It lives in maps where Tartary stretches vaguely across Central Asia for centuries, a land of imagined khans and exotic caravans. It lives in books where Marco Polo's travels inspired generations of adventurers and charlatans. It lives in memory in Mongolian songs, Russian customs, Chinese court records, and Persian epics. And it lives in you as you've wandered through the ruins, the steppe, the cities, and the dust. You've felt the chill of a Khan's banner overhead, heard the gallop of hooves on frozen ground, watched empires rise from yurts and fall into palaces. The final breath of the Mongol Empire wasn't a failure. It was a transformation from power to presence, from rule to resonance. You sit beneath a wind-carved rock eating dried meat and stale bread and smile. The stars above you are the same ones Genghis Khan once followed across the desert. The difference is you know how the story ends, and yet you can't help but wonder, what if another writer somewhere on the edge of the world still dreams of a banner flying over 10,000 tents? What if the empire never truly died? What if it simply went to sleep? The wind has softened. Your boots are worn. The road behind you stretches so far now that it no longer feels like a path. It feels like a past life. You've traced the arc of the Mongol Empire from its fiery birth to its gentle fading, and now at last you arrive at its final resting place in stories in ruins, and in the way the world was changed forever. There is no ceremony here, no final monument. The last traces of Mongol rule dissolve not in a final battle, but in a long sigh, a century of slow fading of influence giving way to integration. You sit beside a collapsed watchtower somewhere between Samarkand and the Kazakh border. Long ago, a Mongol scout may have stood in this same spot, squinting at smoke on the horizon. Now, wildflowers grow between the stones. The tower no longer watches, it remembers. You think of the roads, how they once stretched across continents, bustling with caravans, guarded by soldiers in lamellar armor. You think of the horses, how they carried messages faster than any rival could match. You think of the governance, how census takers and postal inspectors once brought order to a vast and varied land. And you realize the greatness of the Mongol Empire was not just its size, it was its connective tissue. Before the Mongols, Eurasia was fragmented. After them, it was a little more like a conversation. China traded with Persia. Russia borrowed from the steppe. India saw invasions, yes, but also ideas. The Mongols didn't just conquer. They stitched the world together violently, yes, but with lasting consequence. Quirky tidbit number 1. In 1419, long after the empire had shattered, a group of European envoys still attempted to find the great Khan of Cathay to forge an alliance. They never found him, but the fact that they looked, that says something. And then there's the DNA. Studies in the 21st century suggest that a genetic marker associated with Genghis Khan appears in millions of men across Asia. It's not proof of greatness, but it's a footprint, a biological echo. Historians still argue whether the Mongols left more good or more grief. Their wars were brutal, their conquests often genocidal, and yet many of their innovations were ahead of their time. International trade protection, religious tolerance, postal infrastructure, even early passport systems. Quirky tidbit number 2. The Mongol paisa, a small tablet worn around the neck, granted its bearer safe travel food and fresh horses at every relay station. Some 13th century adventurers managed to borrow or forge them, becoming the world's first fake ID carriers. You look now toward the horizon. There's no Khan out there, no banners, just influence. It's in the maps where cities that once lay forgotten became hubs because Mongols put them on the road. It's in language, Persian words in Central Asia, Turkic terms in Russia, Mongol roots in Korean bureaucracy. It's in law and trade and memory. And here in this moment, you finally understand what the empire became. Not a nation, not even a dynasty, but a force. One that passed through history, changed it, and moved on. You mount your horse, just a small one, stocky and shaggy like the kind the Mongols used to ride. You tug gently at the reins, it turns, you begin to ride. The grass brushes your knees. The clouds drift low. The land stretches ahead, unchanged, endless. You pass a group of children racing on ponies, their laughter rolling over the hills. One wears a cap with a top knot. Another carries a toy bow. They don't know the history, but they live in its wake. And as you ride further into the twilight, the air becomes still, not silent, but calm, like something exhaled. The Mongol Empire has ended, but its shadow moves with the wind. And now, as your journey draws to a close, the echoes of hooves grow distant, softer, until they blur into the quiet hum of the night. The stars above you are still scattered like campfires from ancient armies, but no banners fly here, no war drums beat, just the slow rhythm of sleep beginning to take hold. Let the images fade now, step and city war tent and golden throne. Let the names and dates drift like smoke into the cool starlit air. The weight of empire, the clamor of history, it can all rest now. The world the Mongols built is gone, but the lines they carved across the continent's roads, ruins, whispers are still there. Quiet reminders that even the most unstoppable storms eventually become stories. Breathe in slowly. The air is light here, almost sacred. There is no more conquest to follow, no more pages to turn. Just you wrapped in the soft memory of a world that once galloped across the earth and then vanished not with a crash, but with a deep, steady sigh. The grass sways gently, the campfire burns low. You can feel the earth beneath you steady waiting. There's nothing more to chase. You've reached the final camp. Close your eyes now. Rest. The Empire's at peace. And I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.